Controlling Our Narrative. I'm Brooke Thomas. Dr. LaVonya Bennett is a counseling psychologist. She's joining us today from Texas. From San Francisco, Rebecca Pierce is joining us as well. She is a Black Jewish writer and filmmaker. And of course, co-EP O.J. Smith. He's here. He's going to break down our Out of Africa segment later on in the show. And also, as always, join in on the rest of the conversation. I feel like I say this so much, but it's true. Every episode we get more OJ.
More hair.
If there was, just a little bit, right? Every episode,
It's awful, but it's all good.
It's not awful. All right, so let's start off with a story that is never ending, it seems. And I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think the conversation is important. Nick Cannon, who was dropped by Viacom CBS after, a long-standing relationship that they've had. And it was after he made anti-Semitic comments on his podcast. At this point, many of you have heard the story. You generally know what this is about. Nick had former Public Enemy member Professor Griff on the episode. They talked a lot about the Jewish community. They talked about a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, speaking on them as fact. Nick eventually apologized, but I don't so much want to just focus on what happened as much as also talking about the response to what happened and the conversation that happened online after what happened. A lot of people with large followings, people with big public personas, people with big jobs, celebrities, were openly sticking up for Nick. This was before the apology. So after Viacom dropped him, a lot of people were upset by that, which was fascinating for me to see. I didn't expect that. And Nick, even like I said before the apology, he spent a day at least retweeting comments from supporters, people who were saying you did nothing wrong. And Rebecca, I want to start with you because as you're Black and Jewish, and you talk about that, and I think your perspective is incredibly important and also seemed to be ignored, specifically in conversations like this. What were your thoughts? Feel free to break down, what was said. Because a lot of the excuses, I think, was there was education happening, but we can have education without hate and being hateful. Right?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for asking me. And I think it is really true that Black Jewish people are left out of these conversations. And I'm just really grateful to be part of it today. I think the first thing that kind of struck me that was the most sort of upsetting about the Nick Cannon incident was that, not that any of this is new. Basically, everything Nick Cannon said is, he was sort of reflecting what Professor Griff had said, which were sort of NOI, Nation of Islam, talking points about Jewish people that, Minister Farrakhan has been promoting for a very long time. That wasn't surprising to me. It's not new. What upset me was that this was sort of presented in his podcast, which he calls Cannon's Class, as a form of education. And pretty much everything that they said just reflected ignorance and arrogance, I think, towards Jewish people and Jewish identity. And so the very first thing that Professor Griff said that Nick Cannon ended up sort of repeating later, which he got in trouble for, was that Black people can't be anti-Semitic because we are the real Semites. For me, this is, again, this is something Farrakhan has been saying for a long time, and it reflects something that's actually harmful towards Black people to also internalize, which is, first of all, the term anti-Semitism was not invented by Jewish people. It was invented by European race scientists who were trying to make their hatred of Jewish people sound scientific. The term Semitic refers to a language group. It's not actually meant to refer to people. And when it is used to refer to people, it's in a sort of eugenics, racial characterization kind of way that isn't accurate. So when Professor Griff and later Nick Cannon said, we're not anti-Semites, we're the real Semites, you're already internalizing European white supremacy and specifically European Christian hegemony, which is part of that. And that was really concerning to me because what the Nation of Islam and people like Farrakhan are responding to a lot of the time, which is a valid problem, is that Black people, we were robbed of our history, right? And in trying to rebuild a new Black identity, a new understanding of Black history, we can't fall back on the same sort of systems that robbed us of our identity in the first place. And And there's a lot of references to Jewish people that are really couched and sort of based in like Christianity. And I think this is a really frustrating thing for a lot of Jewish people, because when we use terms like Hebrews, when we use, when we identify as, with ancient Israelite people, that's not, we're not referencing Christianity at all, or Christian sort of understandings of what those terms mean, even if it's the same terms. Jewish people are referencing our own traditions, our Torah, which we read in Hebrew, which may be a similar book to the Old Testament, but really it's in a different language. So we're already kind of working from a different place. And I think what really struck me about the Nick Cannon conversation is it's just the same place of thinking that you know about other people when you really don't. And I think this isn't the only anti-Semitic issue that's happened in the Black community recently. You had Deshaun Jackson sharing this sort of weird fake Hitler quote on Instagram. And one of the responses to that from within the Black community that I thought was excellent was Jamel Hill had this point, which is like, just because we've experienced racism doesn't mean we can't be culturally arrogant. And I think that's really what this boils down to, is both a search for Black people to identify ourselves, to understand our own history better, which I support, and then doing that in a way that is both, arrogant towards Jewish people and other groups, and also based in a sort of like trying to reclaim elements of white supremacy that are not actually going to help us in the long run.
LaVonya, feel free to jump in, because I feel like we've had conversations, and not even just specific to this, but I feel like you teach me a lot. And something also that, Rebecca, that you just touched on, it's like Oppression Olympic. And why is it so hard for us to get that bashing one marginalized community doesn't uplift in any way? That I think that seems to be what people think, like there's a race to equality and it means jumping over other groups. And also there was something that people who, mean well, saying things like, the Jewish community and the African-American community, they're not mutually exclusive. And we have to stop doing that.
Yeah, I think another point, and I want to be careful here and recognize that I'm speaking as an outsider, and so I welcome to be corrected at any point in time, because I'm always on a journey to be a better person, so I don't presume to situate myself as perfect or anything close to it. But so I welcome that, if you're okay with that. But in regards to the Oppression Olympics, there tends to be within the Black community in our quest for equity or deconstructing systemic powers of racism and everything else, this idea that we can only do that if we move into the role of the oppressor. And so then, as you said, Rebecca, is that at times that presents, and probably more times than we'd like to admit, but at times that presents as us taking on or internalizing ideologies that are actually wholly incongruent with our histories, our beliefs, and it comes from this Eurocentric perspective of what it means to not be oppressed, which is to be the oppressor. And so I think there has to be a transition and a shift to recognizing that our oppression is all rooted in the colonialization and genocide of the U.S. And it all stems from there, right? That Eurocentric white supremacy, patriarchy. And we have to begin to deconstruct those things outside of us, but also within us, as we move towards our quest for equity, freedom, liberation, or whatever you want to call it.
I feel like there's so much more left to this conversation. So, Rebecca, I want to, completely give you the floor. This is educating, even.
Well, can Rebecca, can you explain something to me? What exactly do you mean by cultural arrogance? I've never heard that before.
Yeah, so this was something that I was sort of like riffing on from Jamel Hill's piece in The Atlantic, where she talks about this. And I think it's just thinking you know better and you can tell other people what their culture is when you haven't done the work at all to engage it. And I think for me being, Black Black in the Jewish community and Jewish in the Black community, I experience this from sort of both sides all the time, where people want to talk about each other, but they don't know the other person to talk about them, you know, if that makes sense. Like, and so I think there's a tendency, like this sort of claim of like, we're the real Hebrews. What makes you think that when Jewish people say Hebrew, they mean the same thing that you mean when you say it, right? We're coming from like a different context, right? And so to sort of speak on other people like you know their contents, I think it is an arrogant thing to do. And you know, we all can like, you know, do better and learn more. And some of this isn't necessarily just Black people's fault. Like if you've been, you know, if your religious education is rooted in, you know, not just like the Black church, which is a really important and like liberating thing in a lot of contexts, but also like, where did we learn Christianity from? We learned Christianity during slavery. I've had the sort of privilege to benefit from both Jewish and Christian religious education. I sort of see how people talk about themselves, talk about each other. And I really don't think we're talking about the same thing a lot of times when we use some of these terms, right? So the sort of idea of like, there's an idea in early Christian theology of like supersessionism, that Jewish people had a covenant with God. And when they didn't become Christian, they broke that covenant, they failed. And now that covenant belongs to Christians, right? From a Jewish perspective, this is a pretty problematic idea, right? And when we take this idea and we filter it through European colonialism, anti-Black racism, and then Black people trying to find their own way in a country where everything they had, everything about who we were, was stolen from us, you can end up pretty like, you know, confused and have some twisted ideas about what these things mean. And it doesn't mean that Black people don't have a legitimate relationship to some of these like liberatory ideas that they got from Christianity. But it does mean we have to unpack how we got those ideas, what they told us about ourselves that wasn't true, and what they told us about other people that wasn't true.
I think unpacking the ideas and I want to say kind of fact from fiction, and like some things just need to be said in plain English. Like, I don't think a lot of the Black community realizes that there are Black Jewish people. Yeah. Even though wasn't James Brown and Sammy Davis Jr. both Jewish? I know Sammy Davis Jr. was. I know
Sammy Davis Jr. James Brown. It's not clear like to what extent he was engaging, but he was engaging in Judaism and like Jewish culture. And I want to be careful about talking because I don't want to like claim him without his permission, right? But there is a really deep and special relationship between Black folks and Jewish folks. And there are a lot of different ways to be Black and Jewish. You have Ethiopian Jews who practice a form of Judaism that's older than the Judaism I practice, which is based in like my European Jewish ancestry, right? You have Jewish people, you know, all over the continent of Africa. You have Jewish people who were in the United States practicing Judaism for generations. And you can find a whole ton of different traditions. We do know that there are accounts of people who were Jewish and brought to the United States enslaved. There were also accounts of, you know, I think there's like one case, I forget the man's name, but there was a case of a Moroccan man who was brought as an enslaved person who was Jewish. There's also cases of, you know, European, Sephardic, or Ashkenazi Jews who owned slaves, and that can be the source of the relationship sometimes. So we have like a very complicated but rich history. And I think the fact that for Black folks, the Old Testament was a source of liberation, and a lot of the symbolism of like the Passover story, for example, which is really important in Judaism, the story of the Hebrews moving from slavery to freedom, is also important to Black people. We are in relationship and we are in conversation. We just have to understand the limits of that conversation or how it's been carried out so far. And I think bringing Black Jews into the conversation more is a really important sort of tactic we can use to like understand the places where we intersect and the places where we differ a little better.
That makes sense.
It does. I follow you on Twitter, Rebecca, and that's how I knew that you would be like great for this conversation. But I've learned so much just from like watching your tweets, like somebody who grew up in this, you know, super like Southern, like Baptist family, and then not knowing at all about any other religions, right? And then learning what is widely taught about other religions. And then even like your tweets have been breaking that down. And I find it fascinating, not even fascinating, but it's, I don't know, it's wrong, but your perspective seems left out of a lot of different angles of this conversation, you know, not even just specifically. And I noticed that just from your tweets and like different things, that you respond to in different conversations that you're having about Judaism, about, the Black community, about everything. And I wonder why, why, like, people who are Black and Jewish, that just seems, of course, like I want to hear from somebody who's Black and Jewish before I say this.
So we're having this sort of debate in the Jewish community right now about why Black Jewish voices are left out. And I think there's different reasons and like situations in both the Black and Jewish community for why this happens. In the Black community, I think we're coming from a place where the Black church is really important, and people sort of assume that as like the default position. That's your cultural context if you're a Black person. For me growing up, I had, I'm Jewish, my mom's Christian, my grandma's a different kind of Christian, my auntie's was Muslim, part of the Nation of Islam at one point. I grew up around a lot of different traditions. And so for me, it's very normal that there's a plurality, that there's always going to be more than one perspective, and there's always something else that you need to hear or consider before you kind of like make up your mind. And so like, I think there's very specific reasons why Black Jewish folks, and we are a very small part of the Black community, right, are not always heard. Within the Jewish community, we know now that Jews of color are between like 10, 12 to maybe 15% of the Jewish community. And that's actually we're a bigger portion of the Jewish community. And this is not just Black folks, but Jews, people who are POC and Jewish at the same time. We're a bigger portion of the Jewish community than the Jewish community makes up of the American community, right? But our voices are just now being heard. And I think one issue is that we can kind of complicate people's easy narratives. In the Jewish community in the US is mostly Ashkenazi Jews. These are folks from Eastern Europe originally. That's not the only type of Jewish person there is. In other countries, you'll find that the majority of Jewish people might be from the Middle East, or might be from, maybe even like parts of Africa and different places. So there's sort of in the same way the Black community has sort of a Christian hegemony, the US Jewish community has sort of like a European hegemony that we're dealing with. And I think between those two things, the voice that is neither European in the Jewish community, or maybe European and something else in the Jewish community, or the voice that isn't necessarily Christian in the Black community, can kind of get pushed down. And I think there's a lot of interesting, and we're not the only group in either of these communities that's dealing with this, right? But we're in an interesting racial justice moment where people care about what are our relationships to each other, or are at least pressured to act like they do, right? So it's a moment where I think voices like mine, and I'm not the only one, and there's a lot of people who are both Black and Jewish who might have a totally different perspective than me, but like where our voices can kind of be uplifted, and I think we can do stuff to both make our personal situation better being in these communities, and also help our communities address some of the really complex issues that we're facing in this moment.
I think a lot of Black people don't actually realize that there are Black Jewish people. And I think that, especially if you take somebody like Professor Griff and Nick Cannon, and them having a Nation of Islam type of background, anybody with a background in the Nation of Islam, including myself, because I was raised as a Christian, or in a Christian household and Muslim household. My dad was in the Nation of Islam. I almost know for sure, if you can break down and unpack some of the things that you're saying that are rooted in European Christian rhetoric, a lot of it would disappear. Because, I mean, you saying that for me, I'm like, are you serious? I'm repeating the same stuff that these European Christians are, who, I know what they did to me, and I know all the lies that they told to me. And so it only makes sense. And they lie about us all the time. And they project us in a way all the time. So to me, it makes sense that they would do it to somebody else, even, if they happen to look like them. They're not Christian at the end of the day. And we all know it happened to Jewish people not everybody knows the history of Jewish people in Europe, and how they were basically, all throughout the history of Europe, they've had a hard time, right? Yeah. And so I think if more Black people were educated towards that, and they knew that they were basically repeating racist, then a lot of it could stop. But I guess this is one of those teachable moments. But I know a lot of Black people, how they're saying they believe this is fact. But I could see where those facts come from. We think all the things that come from that area are facts, like the way that we grew up. And a lot of us, even though we're not Muslim, I think Brooke brought this point up at one point. In the Nation of Islam, they call Minister Farrakhan minister instead of the traditional, I can't remember.
Like Imam.
Like Imam?
Yes, Imam. Yes, instead of Imam Farrakhan, they call him Minister Farrakhan, and the minister is a Christian term, and so even in the Nation of Islam, we still have that Christianity background, and
a lot of the stuff he says sounds like a Baptist teacher.
Right, and so I think if more of that was brought to light, then it'd be easier to unpack a lot of the things that we're talking about now.
I think you're right. And I think a big part of this is that if you look at the history of the nation, which goes back to like the early 20th century, Christian influence is part of it. The Christian Bible is part of the Nation of Islam theology. I don't think that means the Nation of Islam is a necessarily bad thing. You know, I'm not here to say Christianity is a bad thing either. But you do have to understand that at the time that these organizations like the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, some of the Black Hebrew Israelite traditions were being made, people were trying to move away from like white Christian supremacy, but they were also very attached to certain things that we got through that. And it doesn't mean you can't still have a relationship to, for example, the King James Bible or whatever. But you have to kind of unpack, like, if we're going to say we're Afrocentric and we're rejecting white supremacy and the things that white supremacy taught us, what are we bringing with us? And what is the foundation of our new tradition? And I think the sort of synergy between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism that you see as a sort of a natural progression of Abrahamic people like living together in places like the United States and Black folks being influenced by all these things in a lot of different ways, that can be a really powerful cultural tool for us. But we have to engage it critically, and we have to look at, like, when we talk about Jewish people as bankers, greedy, controlling the media, what is that, like, where is that coming from?
Right. I don't think we realize where it's coming from.
And if you look historically, what has been the use of these ideas? Why have they persisted? It's because they help sort of camouflage the real system of power. And we can have a conversation about how Jewish people in the United States, for the most part, have assimilated into whiteness and are part of that power structure. But if you're blaming Jewish people for that power structure, like the Nation of Islam does with its book, The Secret Relationship Between the Blacks and the Jews, where Jewish people are portrayed as orchestrating slavery, right? You're letting a lot of people off the hook who were involved in that. And Jewish people were involved in these things, but they were not the ones driving it, you know?
Right. I get it.
So we have to understand our history. And so it's frustrating to me when Nick Cannon is like, I'm going to tell you all the real history. And what he's repeating is actually a sort of mythology that protects white Christian supremacy in this country. I
swear to you, I think if more people realized that was happening, they'd have a problem, especially Nick Cannon himself.
Totally.
That's the only way it works, though, is that you trick all of these other people to help you protect yourself.
Right.
Now we've just gotten to the point where different people of different backgrounds don't even realize that they're doing it.
Yes. Yeah. It's a pillar of divide and conquer for sure.
And the Jewish community, we have our own battle with this. And, you know, when I'm in Jewish spaces, I'll be having the almost opposite conversation of this, is like, how are we also internalizing messages about Black folks and other minorities that make us feel safe because we can feel like white people, but really it's just buying into a system that harms us as well, you know?
Yeah.
So and I think a lot of Black folks, just one thing I want to say is, like, they have a sort of righteous indignation when they're asked to be responsible for people like Farrakhan, because that can come across as like very like infantilizing almost, and like making people responsible for sort of like the worst voice in their community, or boiling down Farrakhan, who's a very complex figure, into like one or two statements that are very incendiary, right? So I think that people do have a natural reaction against what they perceive as like white people telling them what to do and who they can interact with. But at the same time, we have to understand what it is that we're perpetuating when we engage in some of this stuff.
This has been a great conversation. I mean, I feel like we can just go for the whole hour, or I should move on. But unfortunately, let's move on to the next story. Because I just want to get, you know, everyone's thoughts. There's so much going on. Right now in St. Louis, Mark and Patricia McClaskey, they've been charged with felony unlawful use of a weapon and a misdemeanor charge of 4th-degree assault. You may remember those names because they were the couple who were caught on video pointing guns directly at protesters who were marching through their neighborhood. So a couple things happening right now. The governor of Missouri has been saying before the charges were even announced, that he is prepared to pardon this couple. And now, after the charges were announced, Missouri's AG, Attorney General Eric Schmidt, he said he's seeking to dismiss the case. This is a little bit of what he said.
A political prosecution such as this one would have a chilling effect on Missourians exercising the right to self-defense. The law in Missouri is clear and must be protected. We're in the middle of a crisis of violence in our neighboring cities here in Missouri, including in St. Louis. My office is committed to working with law enforcement, state and federal partners, and community leaders to protect our communities.
So he called it a political prosecution, and there's been a bit of a battle between the chief prosecutor in St. Louis. Her name is Kimberly Gardner. She's a Black woman. Bit of a long battle between the police union and her, the AG and her, the governor of Missouri and her, and now it comes to this. LaVonya, I'll start with you. I mean, does anything surprise you at this point? I think I struggle constantly with like my feelings about how we use our criminal justice system. And then also the fear of like, what if I were participating in a protest, just walking, and someone pointed their gun at me and they got scared or they tripped, or how bad this could have been. And to see, you know, the people in power saying that there's no problem with this behavior.
Yeah, I think we're seeing white supremacist patriarchy doing what it's supposed to do, right? Mm-hmm. It's unfortunate that folks have been able to like rally around issues of, you know, anti-Blackness or just racism, xenophobia, sexism, you know, homophobia, transphobia, all of that, and began to make progress. But we can see that sometimes that progress is stagnated or kind of halted or challenged a little bit whenever we have folks like this who are coming outside doing something that if this was 5 years ago, surely would have gotten arrested for, likely anywhere, even in conservative states. But the tricky thing about white supremacy, patriarchy, is the way that it's able to shapeshift over time. And so none of this, absolutely none of this is surprising. And in fact, white supremacy is doing exactly what it should do, which is, you know, protecting those that it needs to protect, adjusting to the way in which the times have evolved, and continuing to harm like the most vulnerable bodies that, you know, are within this nation. So I'm not at all surprised.
Rebecca, part of a conversation happening online that I saw, people were like, can you imagine if things were switched and this couple were Black? Could you ever imagine the governor coming out and saying, I'm going to involve myself in the prosecution of this Black couple who were pointing guns at a bunch of white people who were protesting, I don't know, math or something, and pardon them because that's okay?
Look, if a Black couple did this, I don't even know if they would be alive right now to be pardoned.
Right.
You know, like that's the sort of structure that we're dealing with. And I think, you know, like what was just said was like this structure is created to protect white people no matter what they do. And, you know, we know the history in this area in St. Louis that has been the rightful site of uprisings by Black folks because white folks are so entrenched in power. And what we're seeing now, what struck me about that image is this is what white people do when they're afraid of losing just a little bit of it. Not even being treated like how Black people have been treated, but just Black people being something closer to equal. And it is a challenge to deal with this because, again, we don't want to uphold the prison industrial complex as a way to solve all of our conflicts, right? Especially when we're trying to undo it. But the fact that even that broken system cannot be applied to white people who have done something so dangerous and so just obviously wrong. If you know anything about gun safety, that picture is a mess. A lot of conservatives were making fun of these people because, like, you don't know how to hold a gun, you know? But it's just
right
such a stark. Exactly. It's such a stark example of like inequality in the way that it's built into our justice system, that these people are being protected.
There was so much about this that like could just be broken down into different conversations. Even their biggest defense was and there's a discrepancy between if the gate was open or it wasn't, but their biggest defense is this is a private neighborhood, a private street, and obviously like your doorway is private, and that makes sense, your driveway. But even the conversation about why private neighborhoods and actual streets, like other human beings, tax-paying human beings in this city, are not allowed on every street in the city. Even the history of how that begun, it all comes, it's white supremacy. It's all rooted in that. And how just even when I think about that, that's been so normal to me, like, oh yeah, sure. But how not like normal that seems, that there are actual streets that you're not allowed on. There's a gate there. That's wild.
I'm used to it. I live in Los Angeles. I'm used to gated communities, and not being able to walk there, it just seems normal, actually, to me.
Yeah.
But they were walking through the middle of a gated
Angeles
community?
Yeah.
We just had in San Francisco
A gated community.
It's an interesting question.
I said, why would you protest? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rebecca.
They were taking a shortcut to the mayor's house.
All right.
Interesting.
Or I'm not sure. I thought the mayor's house was in that neighborhood.
I think so too, but I'm not totally sure.
Okay.
Which is also a whole other conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Wow.
Rebecca, did I cut you off?
Oh, I was just going to talk about how in San Francisco we had a case where there was a similar thing of a private street, and someone bought out the street from underneath the sort of like rich people who live there, and it was a big controversy about like who can park here, who can be here, and like these are just like this history is a reflection of American apartheid and like keeping people out of certain areas, and there's ways that it can be subverted. But I'm glad this case at least is getting us to talk about what does it mean to have a private street that like only certain people are allowed to walk on.
Yeah. There's also like in LA, private beaches that aren't technically private, but you wouldn't tell by like how the person who lives in front of that that area of the beach, how they are governing it. Different restaurants and neighborhoods, in cities all over the country, like mark off valet only when it actually is totally perfectly legal and fine for everybody to park there. There's just so many ways.
Because I will pull up to a valet spot.
It depends on the city. It depends on the city and what agreement is made. So don't do that. But in a lot of cities, areas that are marked off as valet, they're just really taking over the street, and it's just being seen as normal.
I did not know that.
Let's find them all and go and park there. Go and stand there. Listen, I will fly there. I'm down for it.
Yeah, I didn't know I could do that. Like, I didn't know it was perfectly fine to do that. I had no idea.
I mean, I'm sure it depends because in LA
rude.
parking is wild.
Rude. Right.
Yeah. But even like think about it. If you pay taxes in a city, is it not wild that somebody can tell you only people who live on this street can park here? Only people who are going to eat at this restaurant can park here.
I mean, that's how Paradise Cove is, and I don't really mind because it's not a lot of people on the beach.
It's all like.
But I get it. It's wrong.
Yeah.
Especially the way they kind of patrol up and down the beach is wrong. It's like they used to do in Compton. My dad told me at one point that Black people were absolutely not allowed in Compton. If you were Black and going through Compton, you were going to have a problem. Mm-hmm. Blew my mind. Couldn't believe it. But I've seen the tapes. It's a real thing. And so I feel like this kind of evolved into that, but still, just coming from a place where, I mean, just picture not allowed to be able to walk through Compton. And then, somebody.
That's happening. That's a byproduct of gentrification that's happening.
Well, now, but I'm saying,
now. Yeah,
now, but like for years, it wasn't like that. In Inglewood, for years, it wasn't like that.
Yeah.
But before gentrification, before it was at one point, before, Black people got there or ended up moving into those neighborhoods, it used to be a thing where they couldn't be over there. Yeah. And it's crazy that, that's even a thing. And now you have gated communities and places like that where, you could be arrested or, be cited for trespassing or something like that, just walking through there.
So much going on. All right, in Georgia, y'all, the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, he is suing the mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, but for a few things. He's saying she violated his executive order by requiring masks in Atlanta. Also, she banned gatherings of more than 10 people, and he says that's a violation of his executive order. He himself has encouraged masks, but he just says he doesn't want them mandatory. He also wants the judge to stop Mayor Bottoms from issuing press releases or making statements to the press that she has the authority to impose more or less restrictive measures than himself. Rebecca, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We've got the governor fighting with trying to, I guess, stop the mayor of a city from protecting the people who live in that city from COVID-19 to the best of her abilities. Which is not, I guess, maybe not even, it's the blueprint. The president has been doing it to the governors of certain states. So this is just kind of like another page in that chapter. But what are your thoughts?
I'm actually doing it.
I think the first thing we have to remember is Brian Kemp is only the governor of Georgia because of voter suppression, right? So he forced his way into this position of leadership and is now doing the exact opposite of what the people of his state need from a purely like public health perspective. And it's obviously like the fact that, you know, he's coming up against a Black woman mayor of a Black city and trying to like intervene in these like public health measures. It's about white supremacy and control and these same things that we've been talking about, but also in the same way as Trump, like a very like petty, egotistical way of like, how dare she get on camera and say that she has like authority to disagree with me? And so it's just, again, the same system trying to protect itself, in this case, to the detriment of the people it's supposedly supposed to serve. Because like white Georgians are not safe right now. You know, they're going to die in large numbers, in part because of these policies. So I think we're just kind of at this endpoint of white supremacy where it's like the power is shifting and they're scared and they're clamping down in ways that don't make any sense because it's motivated by fear.
Right. Definitely.
LaVonya, I think there was also like a shift in the conversation, a little bit of more like people were like, felt like, aha, because initially he was upset that she was requiring masks and she was making a tighter order than he had. And then it was, but also I want her to stop talking to the press.
I mean, somebody has to make it make sense because it doesn't make sense. Right? I could just never fathom, first of all, how wearing masks at this point has become a political issue. And I think like that's where we're at. And so as already stated, like they're putting so many people in danger by doing so. Or we see yet again where like the lives of the minority are just really dispensable, right? Well, only 2% of children are going to die, or only 1% of the adult population are going to die from the coronavirus or COVID-19. And so we can see where these likely marginalized, but at least minority populations are once again being, marginalized, oppressed, whatever, not cared about. And then we also see Black women, per usual, trying to save the day. But I mean, none of it makes sense, and it's disappointing that people's lives get reduced to politics with the way that he's navigating this issue. And whatever argument that is there about not making it mandatory or not wearing a mask, like it just doesn't make sense. I've actually had time to. I do a lot of my work in hospitals, and so I spent a lot of time in an infectious disease clinic, especially at the onset of the pandemic. And one of the things that we know is like, okay, people are saying, well, I can't breathe, or it's lowering my O2 rates, and but then they're also
that argument makes no sense.
Yeah, but then they're also saying like the masks are not productive, or from blocking the particles. But one, we're talking about particles of two different sizes, and so either you can't breathe or the masks don't work. Like, but you can't have both.
Yeah,
literally doesn't make sense. And that's what we're all like. A lot of this doesn't make sense because well, and let me say, white supremacy makes a lot of sense, right? We understand the function and the utility, but as it's like shape shifting, as we talked about, some of it doesn't make sense. And so like at this point in time, you know, the governor is not even protecting the people that would be his constituents, which also, you know, doesn't make sense. You're acting against your own self-interest if we want to look at it, you know, in that way. But none of this makes sense. And reducing
and you know what's
is problematic.
When people say like, you know, like I can't breathe, wearing something over your face for a very long period of time, sure, it's not going to be comfortable. Wearing a hat is not always comfortable for me. But the point is that you're still supposed to be staying at home.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's like, you're not supposed to be wearing a mask all day because you're supposed to be at home. And the people who can't be at home, I don't see any of them complaining. They're dying for the rest of us to help protect them. So yeah, I feel like that it's just people just want to be able to do what they want to do because you can always go home. You're supposed to be at home.
Yeah.
You can order delivery. You can sit in your
masks.
car and call the grocery store. Some of them will bring your stuff out to you. Like, you're supposed to be at home. Like, what are you doing? I wish people would stay at home.
Right.
Yeah, so this can be over and I can go get a haircut.
Right.
That's
I just wish people would stay at home.
this needs to be over.
I know.
I'm over it. I'm so over it.
OJ, let's do out of Africa. OJ is not getting a haircut until America can get a haircut.
Right.
And
our
yeah, me neither.
the
I'm not getting a
gym, or you know, maybe if the strip club open back, then I'll feel safe. You know what I'm saying? Like as soon as you know you can have that one-on-one, people can be that close to you, or maybe a comedy club open because I have a few friends that are comics and I miss going out because you know I get the VIP, I'll be backstage and it's so fun. But when those things come back, then I'll feel better, and you know, me getting a haircut, everything will be awesome. I'm dreaming of the day, man. I'm dreaming of the day. I can't wait. I have plans. We're going to throw a party. I'm seriously going to throw a party when this is over. I'm not playing. But recently, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, he paid tribute to the late John Lewis for uniting the continents, the two continents, United States and, you know, Africa, South Africa, in the struggle to end racist inequality and affirm universal human rights. So the other day he paid he paid honor to the congressman, which I think is awesome for just another us being recognized over there for the work we do over here. I think goes a long way in relations as far as bridging the gap. He also said Congressman John Lewis was a global icon in the fight for human rights and equality. He was a civil rights leader who dedicated his life to the attainment of equality for all people and to the ending of the legacy of colonialism, slavery, and the crime against humanity that was apartheid. So, you know, our struggle is the same around the world. And like Martin Luther King said, justice to one person somewhere is justice to everybody everywhere. And I feel that way about Black people and us being disrespected when, you know, so it's important for us to recognize our accomplishments across Africa, across the diaspora. And those things will help us understand each other and bridge the gap that we have between each other. So rest in peace to John Lewis, and thank you for all you've done, sir. Everything you've done it's helped, you know, it's helped us advance in this country to where we can say, no matter how we're treated, we still own a piece of this country. Like, this country is definitely ours, no matter how they treat us. It's definitely our country, just like it's their country. And John Lewis is a staple in that fight. So rest in peace to him.
Yeah. We did lose an icon, I think.
Yeah. Then it was two on the same day.
It was two on the same day, yeah.
Rest in peace to C.T. Vivian as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know a lot about that man, but I do know that he was also there with John Lewis and I get these two people confused all the time. He died before John Lewis. What was his name?
You're talking about the congressman?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Elijah Cummings.
Yes.
Who everybody gets. Which is like so wild. It doesn't bother me as much when just random people get them mixed up. But like, if you worked with these men, you have to be able to tell them apart. If you worked with them, but like so many people that I've worked with has not been able to tell me apart from somebody whose skin was the same tone as mine. Because also like we were rarely in the same place, so I think it was like shocking for everybody, especially in my business. There's rarely two of us, and then but then it is, that has been gross. But yeah, and a lot of the work that Congressman Lewis never stopped working, never. But a lot of what he did and a lot of things that he fought for, they weren't that long ago. And without he and his crew, like there's so much of our life would be different.
Yeah, slavery didn't end that long ago. It was, 150 something years, and then there was Jim Crow after that, which we're still not 100 years over. Like there's still people alive who remember Jim Crow very well. I mean, and then all those people from that era, John Lewis, Elijah Cummings, they all touched a slave or had a relative that was.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And we can touch them if you think about it. So we're not that far removed, even though, I mean, even the last 4 years seem like 20 years.
Yeah. Before we go, I like everybody to just like pitch their social media if you want to. And if you have any projects upcoming, if there's anything that you think the people who are listening or watching on YouTube or Facebook, if you think they should check out, anything you think they should read, anything, the floor is yours. That was loud. Really loud.
So if folks want to follow me on Twitter, it's at aptly_engineered, or you can just look up Rebecca Pierce. I have a website, RebeccaPierceFilms.com, where you can see all my writing and film work is there. And if you're interested in learning more about either anti-Black racism in the Jewish community or issues of anti-Semitism in the Black community, a lot of my writing on there addresses these things.
Nice.
Awesome. So I actually don't have a large digital footprint, but if you're interested in diversity or multicultural trainings, which I do across the nation, you're welcome to email me. Or if you're interested in talking about racial trauma or trauma of the oppressed, I'm glad to do that as well, since that's my interest area. But because I don't have a large digital footprint, you can also like send me a pigeon, and I usually receive those as well.
Oh my God. You're also going to need a new private email, huh?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yes.
Get on that. We'll get on that, right? Thank you both for being here. I think this was a great conversation. I feel like I was nervous about this conversation, just like so much that I don't know.
Right.
So, yeah. So it was nice. I appreciate you both. Thank you. I appreciate you as always, OJ. And please go to the compodcast.net. It's right there at the bottom. If you are watching this, if you're listening to this, make sure to leave us 5 stars, because I'm just guessing like your score, and a review. We're on all podcast platforms. You can also find clips of this on Facebook and YouTube. And thank you for listening.